Hello, you're on the Ruslan Belov channel.
Hello,
and today we'll discuss
you're on
the situation in Ukraine. And today we'll discuss the situation in Ukraine. As of May 24th,
a lot has happened
2025.
today, so let's get started.
A lot has happened
begin
today,
with the
so let's
Huliaipol
get
section
started.
of the front.
We'll begin with
Today
the
reports
Huliaipol
are coming
section
in
of the front.
that Russian units have
Today
made slight
reports are coming
advances
in
the
that
northern
Russian
part of the
units have made
settlement.
slight advances
This
in the
information
northern
is
part
being
of the
published
settlement.
today
by independent
information
analysts.
is being published
Here's
today
how the
by
map
independent
looked.
analysts.
As of the end of May 23rd,
Here's how the map looked.
2025.
As of the end of May 23rd,
all of these territories,
2025,
farmlands located to
all
the
of these
northeast,
territories
and the central part of
farmlands
the
located to the
field
northeast
were firmly
and the
under the
central
control
part
of the
green
Ukrainian
field
armed forces.
were firmly under the control
Today
of the
reports
Ukrainian
suggest
armed
that the
forces.
settlement has been almost
Today
completely
reports suggest
cleared.
that the settlement
At
has
this
been
pace,
almost
we can
completely
confidently
cleared.
expect that
At
within
this
the next
pace,
2 to
we can
3
confidently
days,
expect
the Russian
that
Ministry
within
of
the next
Defense
2
will
to 3
confirm
days,
full clearance.
the Russian Ministry
and
of
perhaps
Defense
we'll
will
see
confirm
objective
full
control
clearance.
footage,
And
possibly
perhaps we'll
showing
see
Russian
objective
flags.
control footage.
Next, we move to
possibly
the
showing
Komar
Russian
section of the
flags.
front. Next,
Let
we
me
move
remind
to
you
the
that
Komar
yesterday,
section of the front.
the Russian Ministry of
Let me
Defense,
remind you that
more
yesterday,
precisely, the
Russian
Vostok
Ministry
Task
of
Force,
Defense
more
released
precisely,
objective
the
control
Vostok
footage
Task Force,
confirming full
released
control
objective
and clearance
control
of the
footage
settlement of
confirming
Otradna.
full control and
In that
clearance
footage
of the
published
settlement
by
of
the Russian
Otradna.
side,
In
we
that
can
footage
clearly observe
published
how
by
the
the
battle
Russian
for the
side,
village
we
unfolded.
can clearly observe
The day
how the battle
before,
for the
we had
village
seen
unfolded.
footage of Russian units
The day
dropping
before,
leaflets
we had
offering
seen footage of
Ukrainian
Russian
troops
units
the chance
dropping
to
leaflets
surrender.
offering Ukrainian
Apparently,
troops the
that offer
chance
was
to
rejected.
surrender. Later we saw footage with Russian flags raised at various locations
with
throughout
Russian
the
flags
settlement.
raised at various
There is now no
locations
doubt
throughout
that the village of
settlement.
Otradny is fully
There is
under
now
the
no
control
doubt
of
that the
Russian
village of
forces.
Otradny is fully
And this
under the
morning,
control
May
of Russian
24th,
forces.
2025,
And this morning, May 24th,
there are reports that Russian forces have
2025,
expanded their
there are
control
reports
zone
that Russian
and
forces
advanced
have
further
expanded
west
their
and
control
northwest
zone
and
toward
toward
the
the settlement
further
of
west
Komar
and northwest,
and possibly even
toward
farther
the settlement
towards
of Komar,
Zaporizhia and possibly even
This
farther
information
towards
is being reported
Zaporizhia.
both by neutral
This
and
information
pro-Russian
is being reported
cartographers.
both by neutral
As
and
for the
pro-Russian
Ukrainian
cartographers.
side, they have not yet
As
commented
for
on
the
the
Ukrainian
situation in
side,
Otradna.
they have not yet commented
They
on
might
the
be
situation
preparing
in
some kind of
Otradna.
provocation.
They
or
might be
planning to make a
preparing
sudden
some kind
move
of
into the village
provocation
to
or
raise a
planning
flag
to make a sudden
and thereby
move
try
into
to
the village
disprove the
to raise a
reports of
flag
Russian sources
and thereby try to
and the Russian
disprove the
Ministry of
reports of
Defense.
Russian sources.
We've seen
and the
such
Russian
a
Ministry
scenario
of
play
Defense.
out in the village of
We've
Bahatia,
seen such a
where the
scenario
settlement
play
was
out
taken
in the
under
village
full
of Bahatia
control by the
where
Russian
the settlement
army,
was taken
with
under
numerous
full
flags
control
raised
by the
in
Russian
various
army,
locations.
with numerous
But the
flags
next
raised
day,
in
a
various
Ukrainian
locations.
unit briefly
But the
entered
next
the village,
day, a
recorded
Ukrainian
a video
unit
with their
briefly
flag,
entered the village
and quickly
recorded
retreated
a video
apparently.
with their flag. So
And
a
quickly
similar
retreated,
provocation in
apparently.
Otradny is quite
So
likely.
a similar provocation
Some
in
sources
Otradny
also
is quite
report Russian
likely.
troop movements
Some
along the
sources also
Mokrayali
report
River.
Russian troop
It
movements
seems
along
that in
the
the near
Mokrayali
future,
River,
fighting for the
it
settlement
seems
of
that in the near
Fedorivka,
future,
a key
fighting for the
location on the
settlement
path
of
to
Fedorivka
Komar
will
a
intensify.
key location on the path
Slightly
to Komar
further
will
north,
intensify.
combat continues for the
Slightly
settlement of
further north,
Alexeyevka.
combat
More
continues for the
precisely, the
settlement
Russian
of
army is
Alexeyevka.
preparing for an
More
assault from the
precisely,
south.
the Russian army
Let
is
me remind
preparing
you,
for an assault from
Bahatia
the
is
south.
under Russian control.
Let me remind you,
There is
Bahatia
currently
is under
regrouping,
Russian control.
ammunition resupply,
There is currently
force build-up,
regrouping,
ammunition
evacuation of the
resupply,
wounded,
force
and preparation
build-up,
for further
evacuation of
offensives,
the wounded,
including
and
a possible
preparation
river
for
crossing
further
over the
offensives,
Volkhya River,
including a possible
At
river
the same
crossing
time,
over the
Russian
Volkhya
units
River.
are actively advancing
At the same
from the
time,
north and
Russian
northeast.
units are actively
Today,
advancing from the
objective
north and
control
northeast.
footage from the settlement
Today,
of
objective
Bodanivka
control
was released.
footage
From the settlement
footage,
of Bodanivka
we can see
was
Russian
released.
soldiers
In the
raising
footage,
Russian flags
we can see
among
Russian
the remaining
soldiers
ruins
raising
of what's
Russian
left of the
flags
village.
among the remaining
Let me
ruins of
remind
what's
you
left
that
of the
around 2 or
village.
3 weeks ago,
Let me
maybe
remind you
more,
that around
the
2 or
Russian
3
Ministry
weeks
of
ago
Defense
had
maybe
already
more,
announced
the
full
Russian
clearance
Ministry of
Defense
Defense
had already announced
However,
the full
during these
clearance
past
of
3
Bodanivka.
weeks,
No objective
However,
control
during these
footage
past
had been
3
released
weeks,
to confirm
no
Russian
objective
control
control
footage
over the
had been
village.
released to confirm
Only
Russian
today,
control
after
over
nearly
the
3
village.
weeks, Russian
Only
sources
today,
have published
after nearly
actual
3
evidence
weeks,
of Russian
troops
sources
being
have present
present
in
in
the
actual
village.
evidence of Russian
I want
troops
to
being
emphasize
present
that
in
we
the
did not
village.
change the map earlier.
I want to
because we had
emphasize
already
that we did not
updated
change
it
the
based
map
on the
earlier
official report
because we had
from the
already
Ministry of
updated
Defense
it based
at
on
that
the
time.
official report from
This
the
is an
Ministry of
important
Defense
point
at that time.
as this kind of delay in
This is an
confirmation
important
has
point
happened multiple times throughout the entire special military operation, throughout the entire special military operations cases today. And we will see what we observe is that Russian forces are steadily advancing. What we observe is that Russian forces are steadily advancing with the aim of flanking moving southwest. Additionally, with the aim of flanking the final stage of the battle. Additionally, it seems that the final stage of the battle for the settlement is located right along the border between the Dnipropetrovsk region and the Dnipropetrovsk region. Now we move toward the N32 highway. Now the Russian army continues to expand its control zone, where the Russian army continues to expand its control zone around the settlements of Novokolomychne, Malinivka,
let's take it
and
step by step,
Novoekonomichne. Starting with Novoekonomichne.
Let's take it step by step.
Yesterday,
starting with
or even earlier,
Novoekonomichne.
there were reports of intense close
or
quarters
even earlier,
fighting
there
on
were
the far
reports of
western
intense close
outskirts of
quarters
Malinivka.
fighting on the far
Ukrainian
western
armed
outskirts
forces
of Malinivka.
tried to launch a counterattack. However, it seems that all attacks were repelled, and Russian forces subsequently launched a counterstrike of their own toward the settlement of Myron. Today, some pro-Russian sources report that the settlement of Malinivka is now fully under the control of the Russian armed forces. At the time this video is being prepared, there has not yet been an official confirmation from the Ministry of Defense, but it may appear during the day. So, if we sum it up, approximately these territories are already under the control of Russian units, at least as of the morning of May 24, 2025. In reality, this is a major advance. Ukrainian units have apparently been forced to retreat further west towards settlements like Nikolaevka and Novoekonomichne. Currently, a very difficult situation has developed for the potential Ukrainian units still positioned within the pocket between Yelizavetovka, Mirolyubovka, and Malinovka. As you can see, there is a rather strong stronghold here with a dense network of defensive fortifications. And apparently, Ukrainian formations on this section of the front are facing a choice: either retreat from this direction or try to hold out as long as possible. Perhaps the Ukrainian side will attempt a de-blocking operation, but it's hard to say. In any case, it appears that the countdown is already on, not in hours yet, but likely in days. But inevitably, in the coming days, the armed forces of Ukraine will be forced to retreat through the fields and forest belts. This, of course, will also come with heavy losses. Once this pocket is cleared by the Russian Federation, all the conditions will be set for a potential further offensive, first in the direction of Mirnoye and possibly later toward Nikolaevka and Novoekonomichne itself, both key settlements that are essentially part of the Pokrovsk agglomeration. Next, we move north, again along the H32 highway. Today, reports are coming from various neutral cartographers about an expansion of the control zone across the wide network of strongholds between the settlements of Shevchenko-Pervoye, Novaya Poltavka, and Popov Yar. Take note of the large number of trenches, anti-tank ditches, and likely anti-personnel defenses. And we can see that gradually, stronghold by stronghold, the Russian side is clearing this area, preparing for a possible further advance deeper into what is now considered part of the Donetsk region. Let's take a look at how the map has changed. According to some sources, as recently as yesterday, these strongholds, as well as nearby ponds, were under the control of the armed forces of Ukraine. Today, we are already seeing the first proof and evidence that these areas are now under the control of the Russian army. So, slowly but surely. However, again, note that despite the daily updates about advances, we are witnessing a growing gap between geolocated progress and the progress reported by various sources. Typically, when such a gap accumulates, geolocations begin to appear shortly afterward. Perhaps today we'll see additional materials that confirm real progress made by Russian units, both along the H32 highway and in the southern part of the Kleban-Byk pocket, from where no reports of any kind have been received recently. Next, we move to the Seversk sector of the front, where the Russian army continues its offensive. According to some pro-Russian experts, Russian units are gradually advancing along the forest line that connects the settlement of Belogorovka with the villages of Grigorovka and Serebryanka. Currently, fighting is ongoing for the next forested area. Slightly to the south, the Russian side published very interesting footage of objective control from the northeastern outskirts of the town of Seversk. These are very important visuals. Let's take a look. Here, we can see a Russian drone flying over the area, likely trying to locate FPV operators, communications equipment, Starlink units, or radios. And it appears that once Ukrainian armed forces positions or equipment are identified, mortar and artillery strikes begin. On the surface, it may seem unimportant, but if we focus on the geography of where these events are happening, the Russian strikes are now being delivered right on the northeastern outskirts of Seversk. But even that isn't the main point. What's crucial is that full fire control and drone surveillance has been established over one of the two critical supply roads used by Ukrainian forces to support units currently positioned in Serebryanka and Grigorovka. So we can see that this section of the road is now entirely under Russian control. And soon, apparently, Russian units will try to push north of this pond along the forest belts in order to close the distance to this road and establish not just drone surveillance, but also direct, possibly infantry-based control. At this moment, the Ukrainian forces seem to have just one remaining supply route, running from the northern part of Seversk up north to Serebryanka, and from there on to Grigorovka. But if the fire control has already been established over this section of the road, then it seems nothing is stopping the Russian army from taking full control of this part of the front as well. So, as we can see, the encirclement of Serebryanka and Grigorovka is starting to take shape. A noose is slowly tightening around these two settlements located along the Seversky Donets River. We should expect active offensive operations and further advances in the coming days. Next, we move to the Lyman section of the front and continue our discussion of Torskoye. Here, the situation is developing similarly to the village of Bogdanovka and many others. Let me remind you that right on the eve of the Istanbul negotiations, the Russian Ministry of Defense announced the complete clearing of the settlement of Torskoye. At that time, most cartographers updated their maps accordingly, with the exception of those who rely strictly on geolocation data and do not take other sources into account. In our work, in addition to geolocations, we use another key source, the daily briefing from the Russian Ministry of Defense, as well as affiliated structures like the Sever and Vostok military groupings, among others. Based on that report, we had fully marked Torsky as under Russian control. However, over the past few days, multiple reports have suggested that the Russian Ministry of Defense may have acted prematurely that day. There was likely no full clearing of the area. Russian forces may have physically been present across the entire village at one point, but later, according to many pro-Russian experts, including those who work exclusively with geolocation data, several corrections and clarifications have emerged. They suggest that Ukrainian forces are still present in Torska and that the village is, in fact, still fully under the control of the armed forces of Ukraine. So this is quite an interesting situation. We'll be watching closely to see how it develops. For now, we're not rushing to recolor the area in favor of the AFU, but we are keeping in mind that the front line in Torsky may not actually look like what we currently see on our maps. Next, we move to the northern Lyman direction, to the area around the settlement of Rydkudub. Today, several sources report advances by Russian forces along the eastern part of the village. If this information is accurate, then as of May 23, 2025, the Russian army has taken control of at least 30% of Rydkudub and is continuing its offensive in a northwestern direction. At this pace, the village may fall entirely under Russian control within the next week, possibly even sooner. This would, in turn, open a window of opportunity for further offensive action from Rydkudub to the southwest and south, with the aim of launching an assault on the settlement of Lyman. Despite the complications in Torsky and what seems to be a prolonged assault on Rydkudub, we should expect intensified combat operations here in the near term. Now to the North Kupyansk direction, important updates are coming from the areas around Radkivka and Kondrashivka. As a reminder, yesterday the Russian Ministry of Defense announced full control over Radkivka. The Zapad West group of forces reportedly cleared the village. Based on that footage, many cartographers updated their maps accordingly. The MOD confirmed it. However, today, new reports are emerging suggesting that Radkivka may not actually be under full Russian control. Some cartographers are expanding Russia's control zone in the northeast part of the settlement, but many pro-Russian analysts are saying that Russian forces may have only reached the forest area in the northeast. Radkivka could still be in a grey zone, and there may not be any Ukrainian units present, but doubts remain. So, as of the morning of May 24th, many reliable pro-Russian analysts and channels are raising questions about the situation. It may not be as definitive as the Ministry of Defense claimed yesterday. For now, we are not altering the map and are still marking Radkivka as controlled by the Russian armed forces. Perhaps today the ministry will release objective control footage to confirm the presence of Russian troops in the village. Today, the Sever North group of forces reported that during fierce battles, Ukrainian resistance was broken in the village of Lochnia. Russian sources say that in recent days, Ukraine had deployed significant elements of the 36th Marine Brigade to Lochnia in an effort to stabilize the front line and push Russian forces back. However, these efforts failed to retain control over the village. Today, a report from a source affiliated with the Ministry of Defense confirms this. So, regarding Lochnia, we are updating our maps to reflect full Russian control. Previously, we had considered nearly all of this area as a grey zone. Now we have the first evidence of complete Russian control over the village. This also signals that fighting for the settlement of Yunakivka has likely already begun. If the Ministry of Defense is confirming control over Lochnia, that implies that Russian forward units are likely already entering the northern part of Yunakivka. Moving to the Tyotkino section of the front, there are reports that Ukrainian units have managed to expand their control zone along Chapaeva Street, at least on the Ukrainian side of the railway, which is the western side. So everything in the triangle between the small river and the railway now appears to be under AFU control. This information is currently being spread by some neutral cartographers, but so far we haven't seen any objective control footage to confirm it. So we'll continue to monitor how the situation unfolds. And that's all for now, dear friends. Subscribe to the channel, leave your likes, and take care.